Her husband and his family threw her out after the birth of a girl, not knowing a billionaire still loved her. I promise this will be the best love story you've ever heard. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Before we begin, I want to speak the most heartfelt prayer over your life. A prayer not from my lips, but from the deepest corners of my soul. May the God of all comfort hold you tonight. May he walk into your home with healing in his hands. May every secret tear you've cried be turned into strength. May your lonely nights become peaceful mornings, and your silent prayers be answered in ways that leave you breathless with joy. I pray love surrounds you like air, and no pain, no fear, no storm will steal your peace again. You are loved, chosen, and seen, more than you'll ever know. Now, family, you know I'm not well, but even through the weakness, I'm still writing. Because this isn't just a YouTube channel, this is our home, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm just healing, and I will be back. Right now, my brother James is helping me narrate, but the story you're about to hear still flows from my heart. Every line, every emotion, every tear. But family, please, I ask you not just as a creator, but as your Mr. Peter, watch the full story. Don't leave in the middle. Stay with me through every scene, every heartbeat, because your time, your love, your presence, it means everything right now. Like this video, comment something warm. Let me feel you standing with me even while I rest. You are my reason to keep fighting. And I promise, when I return, I'll come back stronger with even greater stories made from love and light. So now, take a breath. Let your heart open. Let James speak for me, and let the story begin with all my love.
3 years ago, the October rain hammered against the hospital windows as Rima Rosalinda Washington Morrison pushed through the final contraction, her body trembling with exhaustion after 8 hours of difficult labor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her sweat-dampened face. In the delivery room's sterile brightness, she could hear the muffled voices of Tommy's family arguing in the hallway, their raised voices penetrating even the thick walls. "Just breathe, baby," Tommy whispered, but his voice carried the familiar slur that meant he'd been drinking before coming to the hospital. His hand was clammy against hers, and she could smell whiskey beneath the sharp scent of hospital disinfectant. When Dr. Martinez finally placed the squirming newborn baby girl on Rima's chest, time stopped. Sage Rosalinda was tiny, dark hair still slick from birth, skin the rich golden brown that blended both parents, with a strong cry that announced her arrival to the entire maternity ward. "She's perfect," Rima breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she touched her daughter's impossibly small fingers. Tommy stared down at his daughter, and for a moment Rima saw something soft cross his features. But then the door burst open, and Marlo Tay Morrison swept in like a winter storm, her platinum hair styled despite the late hour. Behind her came Keanu, Tommy's younger brother, his expression carefully neutral as always. "Well," Marlo's voice was crisp as autumn air. "What is it?" "It's a girl, Mama," Tommy said quietly. "Sage Rosalinda." The silence that followed felt endless. Marlo's ice-blue eyes studied the baby, and Rima watched her future mother-in-law's face shift from expectation to something harder to define. A girl. The words fell flat. "And she certainly takes after her mother's side, doesn't she?" Rima's arms tightened protectively around Sage. The comment seemed innocent enough, but the undertone was unmistakable. "She's lovely," Rima said firmly. Marlo's gaze moved between mother and child with cool assessment. "Well, I suppose children often surprise us with how they turn out." The nurse, a kind-faced black woman named Janet, stepped between them with professional authority. "Visiting hours are over. Mom and baby need rest." But Rima had caught the look that passed between Marlo and Keanu, a silent communication that made her blood chill. She'd seen that look before, during the engagement party when they discovered her family wasn't wealthy, during the wedding planning when they'd tried to minimize her family's involvement, during every family dinner where they'd made subtle comments about her background. 3 days later, Rima was finally released from the clinic. The October air remained crisp as Tommy drove them home to the small house they'd rented on Elm Street, the same house where Marlowe had her own key and strong opinions about everything from Rima's cooking to her choice of baby clothes. Rima was still recovering, still adjusting to the overwhelming reality of motherhood, when she noticed Tommy's behavior shifting. He'd promised to take paternity leave, but started leaving for urgent meetings that lasted hours and seemed to require liquid courage. Marlowe's visits became daily occurrences, each one more critical than the last. "The baby cries constantly," Marlowe observed during one of her inspections. "And this house is chaotic. When I had my boys, everything was organized within days." "I just gave birth 3 weeks ago," Rima said through gritted teeth, bouncing a fussy Sage while trying to sort laundry one-handed. "That's hardly an excuse for disorder." The breaking point came on a gray October morning when Sage was 2 weeks old. Rima woke to find Marlowe in the kitchen, holding Tommy's work shirt up to the light. "Smell this," Marlowe commanded, shoving the fabric toward Tommy, who sat hunched over black coffee with bloodshot eyes. Rima caught the artificial scent immediately, cheap perfume that definitely wasn't hers. "I found this in your truck," Marlowe continued, producing a silver earring Rima had never seen. "Along with this." "That's not mine," Rima said immediately, but her words fell into a silence thick with accusation. Tommy's eyes, already clouded with alcohol and exhaustion, fixed on his wife with something that might have been hatred. "You've been cheating on me." "Tommy, no. I've been here with the baby. I haven't been anywhere." "Liar." His fist slammed against the kitchen table, making the coffee cups jump. "My mama found the evidence. You think I'm stupid?" Sage started crying from her bassinet in the living room, and Rima's milk began to let down, soaking through her nightgown. The humiliation of it, standing there in stained pajamas, leaking and exhausted, while her husband and his mother orchestrated her destruction, nearly broke her. "I need to feed her," Rima said, moving toward the living room. "Don't you walk away from me," Tommy's voice cracked like a whip. "I know what you are. I know what my mama warned me about your kind." The words hit like a physical blow. Rima turned slowly, Sage's cries cutting through her heart. "My kind?" "Gold-digging whores," Marlowe supplied helpfully. "I told Tommy from the beginning. Your people always want something they haven't earned." Rima felt something fundamental break inside her chest. These people she'd tried so hard to please, whose approval she'd chased for 2 years of marriage, had never seen her as anything but a threat to their narrow world. "Get out," Tommy said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out of my house." "Tommy, please. The baby, she needs—" "I don't want to see either of you again." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, something official-looking that Marlowe must have prepared. "Sign this, and maybe I won't call the police about your behavior." With shaking hands, Rima read the document. It was filled with legal language she didn't understand, but it seemed to be some kind of separation agreement that waived her rights to support or property. "I'm not signing anything without a lawyer," she said. That's when Tommy grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the tender flesh near her elbow. "You'll sign it, or I'll tell everyone about your cheating. Who do you think people will believe, me or some lying—" Sage's cries grew more desperate, and Rima's body ached with the need to comfort her daughter. Exhausted, isolated, and terrified, she signed what was clearly something Marlowe had printed from the internet. Not real legal paperwork, but intimidating enough to work on an exhausted new mother. She wouldn't discover for 3 years that the document had no legal validity whatsoever. Within the hour, Rima stood on the sidewalk in the October drizzle, holding her 2-week-old daughter and a single diaper bag that contained everything they owned. Tommy had forced them out so quickly she hadn't been able to pack clothes, keepsakes, or any of the baby gifts from her family. As she walked toward the bus stop, her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Zara Bell. "How's my beautiful niece today?" Rima stared at the message through her tears, then turned her phone off completely. She couldn't bear to explain what had happened, couldn't admit how completely she'd failed. What hurt most wasn't Tommy's betrayal. She'd known he was weak. It was remembering the alternative she'd thrown away. 5 years earlier, Peter Charles Avance had proposed to her on a beach in Santa Barbara, offering her a life of love and security. But she'd chosen Tommy instead, convinced that Peter's ambition meant she'd always come second to his business empire. How wrong she'd been. At least Peter's neglect had been about pursuing dreams, not destroying them. Now, standing in the rain with her infant daughter, Rima made a promise to herself and to Sage. They would survive this. They would build something better from nothing, and she would never, ever trust her heart to someone who could throw her away again. She kept her maiden name for herself and gave it to Sage too. If she was going to start over, she'd do it as Rima Washington, the woman she'd been before she'd believed in fairy tales about love conquering all. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes, and Rima climbed aboard, carrying her daughter toward an uncertain future, leaving behind the wreckage of dreams that had never been real anyway. Chapter 2. Shadows and Search. Present day. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., and Rima Washington was already awake, studying the familiar water stain on their studio apartment ceiling. Sleep had become unreliable over the past 3 years, too many nights listening for sounds that might signal danger. Too many nightmares about losing Sage, too much vigilance that had become second nature. She slipped out of bed silently, stepping over the squeaky floorboard that might wake 3-year-old Sage, who was curled up in the single bed they shared. Their apartment was cramped but spotless, every surface scrubbed until it gleamed. Maintaining control over her environment was one of the few securities Rima had left. In the kitchenette, she started her second-hand coffee maker while opening her laptop on the small dining table that served double duty as her office. Before her restaurant shift started at 6 a.m., she had 2 hours to work on freelance marketing projects, the business she'd slowly built one client at a time. Creating this income stream had taken 18 months of nights and weekends, but Rima had finally developed something that belonged entirely to her. She specialized in social media strategy for small businesses, drawing on her education and the experience she'd gained before Tommy convinced her to quit her corporate position. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was more skilled at her career now than when she'd had the luxury of a steady salary. Her phone showed 3 new project inquiries from potential clients who'd found her through referrals. Good. The restaurant job covered rent and basic expenses, but the freelance work was building toward something bigger, maybe eventually toward complete independence from the exhausting double shifts that left her bone-tired every night. "Mama?" Sage's sleepy voice drifted from the bed. "Good morning, sunshine," Rima said softly, closing the laptop. "Want pancakes?" Sage padded over in her favorite pajamas, pink ones with unicorns that Zara Bell had bought for her birthday. At 3, she was already showing signs of the sharp intelligence that would either be her greatest gift or her greatest burden in a world that often didn't appreciate smart little black girls. "Can I help?" Sage asked, dragging her step stool to the counter. "Always." Rima lifted her daughter up, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. These morning moments were sacred, just the 2 of them before the world demanded her attention. While they mixed batter, Rima's mind wandered to the safety checklist that ran constantly in her background thoughts. Door locked, windows secure, escape routes planned, phone charged, pepper spray in purse, keys ready. The hypervigilance exhausted her, but it had kept them safe for 3 years. At 5:45, she walked Sage 3 blocks to her daycare, where Mrs. Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, watched 5 neighborhood children in exchange for reasonable rates that worked with Rima's budget. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but Mrs. Chen was patient and kind, and Sage was learning social skills from the other children. "Be good for Mrs. Chen," Rima said, kissing Sage's forehead. "I always am," Sage replied, with the seriousness that sometimes made Rima's heart ache. 3-year-olds shouldn't have to be serious. 1,200 miles away, Peter Charles Avance stood in his corner office on the 47th floor of the Avance Tower, watching the sunrise paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and pink. He'd been there since 4 a.m., having given up on sleep around 2 a.m., when his mind wouldn't stop racing through acquisition details and market projections. Sleep had become optional since losing Rima. Work filled the void where contentment used to live. His assistant, Phoenix Castile, knocked and entered with coffee and the resignation letter that had been sitting on Peter's desk for a week, the third one this month from yet another employee who couldn't keep up with his relentless pace. "You know," Phoenix said, setting down the coffee with careful precision, "normal CEOs sleep occasionally." Phoenix was one of the few people who could call Peter out without consequences. Peter had found him in foster care 10 years ago, a brilliant 18-year-old aging out of the system with a computer science degree and nowhere to go. Now, Phoenix was his right hand, the closest thing Peter had to family, and occasionally his conscience. "Sleep is overrated," Peter muttered, signing the resignation letter with sharp strokes. "We'll promote Davidson to replace him." "Davidson quit last week. Burnout." Peter looked up sharply. "Since when?" "Since you've been demanding 18-hour days from everyone because you can't deal with your feelings about—" "Don't." Peter's voice carried the warning that made board members nervous. "Just don't." Phoenix raised his hands in surrender, but his expression remained concerned. The investigators called again. Still nothing on Rima Morrison. For 18 months, Peter had employed the best private investigation firm on the West Coast to find the woman who haunted his dreams. They'd searched credit reports, employment records, social media profiles, court documents, anything that might lead to Rima Morrison. The search had consumed resources and time, but Peter couldn't let it go. He needed to know she was safe. He needed to know he hadn't completely destroyed the best thing in his life by choosing work over love. "Maybe it's time to try a different approach," Phoenix suggested carefully. "Like what?" "Maiden names. If she left her husband, which seems likely given what you've told me about him, she might have gone back to her original name." Peter felt something electric shoot through his chest. In 18 months of searching, they'd never considered that Rima might not be using Morrison anymore. "Washington," he said suddenly. "Her maiden name was Washington." Phoenix was already pulling out his phone. "I'll call the investigators." "No." Peter was reaching for his own phone, fingers moving faster than they had in months. "I'll call them myself." Within hours, the investigators had found her. Rima Washington, employed at Celestine's Kitchen in the Arts District, living at 1247 Pine Street, apartment 3B. Single mother to Sage Rosalinda Washington, age 3. When Peter saw the hospital records, birth certificate listing father as unknown, medical bills from the delivery that had gone into collections, no record of any Morrison family involvement, the pieces of Rima's story clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Tommy Morrison had thrown out his wife and newborn daughter. Peter's hands shook as he read the investigators' preliminary report. No child support payments, no contact between Tommy and his daughter, rumors in Tommy's social circle that his ex-wife took off with some other man's kid. The lies made Peter's vision blur with rage, But it was the financial records that broke his heart completely. Rima had been surviving on restaurant wages and cash jobs, moving 3 times in 3 years, always just one emergency away from disaster. "I need everything," Peter told the investigator. "Employment records, financial history, legal documents, medical records, everything. And I want a full background check on Tommy Morrison and his family." "That could take. Money is no object. I want to know what happened to her, and I want to know yesterday." Over the following weeks, the investigation revealed a story that made Peter's controlled fury burn cold and bright. Tommy Morrison's construction business had a pattern of safety violations and wage disputes that stretched back years. His mother, Marlowe, ran a charity that seemed to exist primarily to fund her lifestyle. Bank records showed suspicious cash deposits and transfers that suggested financial impropriety at minimum, fraud at worst. For 8 months, Peter had been building a case that would destroy Tommy Morrison completely. What had started as a search for Rima had evolved into something larger when Peter discovered the scope of Tommy's crimes against workers and the community. His forensic accountants had analyzed every aspect of Tommy's business dealings, finding a web of bid rigging, worker exploitation, and tax evasion that would make federal prosecutors very interested once they had enough evidence to act. The question now was whether Rima would let him back into her life, or whether she'd built walls too high for even his determination to scale. Standing in his office as evening fell over the city, Peter made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would walk into Celestine's kitchen and face the woman he'd never stopped loving. He only hoped she wouldn't run. Chapter 3: Recognition and Walls. The Restaurant Encounter. The lunch rush at Celestine's kitchen was winding down when Peter Charles Avance stepped through the front door. He'd been observing the restaurant for 3 days, learning Rima's schedule, and waiting for the right moment to approach her when she wasn't overwhelmed with customers. Rima was refilling the coffee station, her back to the entrance, when she heard the bell chime that announced another customer. The familiar sound should have been routine. She'd heard it hundreds of times that day, but something made her turn around. Time seemed to slow. Standing in the doorway, scanning the small restaurant with those steel-gray eyes she remembered from 1,000 Dreams, was Peter. He looked older, more refined in his tailored charcoal suit, but she would have recognized the determined set of his jaw and the way he carried himself anywhere in the world. The coffee pot trembled in Rima's suddenly unsteady hands. She managed to set it down without dropping it, but the metallic clink against the warming plate seemed to echo through the dining room. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the sound, but Rima barely noticed. Her heart was racing so hard against her ribs that she felt dizzy. Peter's eyes found hers across the dining room, and she watched recognition dawn on his face like sunrise. For a moment that felt like eternity, they simply stared at each other while the world continued spinning around them. Then panic hit her like a physical blow. "He can't see me like this." Rima was acutely aware of her appearance. The yellow Celestine's kitchen polo shirt that had seen better days, the black pants that were starting to fade from too many washings, the comfortable shoes that prioritized standing for 8 hours over style. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wasn't wearing makeup because cosmetics were a luxury she couldn't afford. This wasn't how she'd imagined seeing Peter again, in the rare moments when she'd allowed herself to imagine it at all. In her fantasies, she was successful and polished, proving that choosing Tommy over him hadn't destroyed her life. The reality was that she was a single mother working double shifts just to keep her daughter fed and sheltered. "I've got it, Mija," said Rosa, the elderly cook who'd become something like a mother figure to Rima. She appeared with a mop and dustpan, her kind eyes concerned as she took in Rima's pale face. "Take a breath." But Rima couldn't breathe. The walls of the restaurant felt like they were closing in, and she could feel Peter's gaze on her like a weight. She needed to get out, needed to run, needed to be anywhere but here where he could see how far she'd fallen. Without thinking, she bolted toward the back exit, pushing through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen and storage area. Behind her, she heard Rosa's voice calling out, "Sir, we'll be right with you." But Rima didn't stop. The alley behind Celestine's kitchen smelled like garbage and disappointment. Rima pressed her back against the brick wall, trying to calm her racing heart and quiet the voice in her head that whispered, "He can't know, he can't see, he can't find out about Sage." She'd built a life on invisibility, on staying beneath notice, on making sure that Tommy and his family could never track her down. Peter's presence threatened all of that safety. Rima. Her name on his lips was like a prayer and a question all at once. She hadn't heard him approach, but Peter was standing at the mouth of the alley, his expression careful and concerned. "Don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Just don't." Peter stopped walking, but he didn't leave. "I know this is unexpected." "Unexpected?" Rima's voice cracked on a laugh that held no humor. "You think this is unexpected? Peter, I haven't seen you in almost 4 years. I thought I'd never see you again." "I looked for you," he said quietly. "For 18 months I looked for you." The admission hit her like a slap. "Well, you found me. Congratulations. You can see I'm doing just fine." She gestured to her uniform, to the alley, to the entire disaster of her circumstances. Peter's eyes were careful, cataloging details, the weight she'd lost, the exhaustion that had become as much a part of her as breathing, the defensive way she held herself like she was preparing for another blow. "Rima, I need you to know." "No." She held up a hand to stop him. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up after all this time and act like we can just pick up where we left off. I'm not the same person I was in college, Peter. I'm not the woman you proposed to." "I can see that." His voice was gentle in a way that made her throat tight with unshed tears. "You're stronger." The unexpected kindness in his words almost broke her resolve. She'd spent 3 years being told by the world that she was less than, that she was broken, that she was lucky to have whatever scraps of life she could manage to gather. Having Peter, successful, powerful Peter, look at her with respect instead of pity was almost more than she could handle. "I made my choice," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I chose Tommy. I chose that life. This is the consequence." "You chose wrong," Peter said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness now. "But that doesn't mean you deserved what happened to you." Rima's breath caught. "What do you know about what happened to me?" Peter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know enough." The implications of his words sent ice through her veins. If Peter knew about Tommy, about the abandonment, about Sage. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand that Tommy Morrison is a piece of garbage who threw away the most precious thing he'll ever have in his life." Hearing Peter say Tommy's name out loud made Rima flinch. For 3 years, she'd tried to pretend that part of her life had never happened, that Sage had been immaculately conceived, and they'd always been just the two of them. Having Peter acknowledge the ugliness of her marriage made it real again. "I have to go," she said, pushing off the wall and heading for the back door of the restaurant. "Rima, wait." "No." She spun to face him, and this time she let him see some of the fire that had kept her alive through the worst 3 years of her life. "I don't know why you're here or what you want, but I can't do this. I can't be your charity case or your guilt project or whatever this is." "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like the successful billionaire swooping in to save the poor, struggling single mother." "Well, I don't need saving, Peter. I've been saving myself just fine." The mention of being a single mother hung in the air between them like a confession. Peter's expression shifted, and she realized he was trying to calculate Sage's age, trying to determine if she'd been pregnant when they'd known each other. "I have a daughter," she said, deciding to confront it head-on. "She's 3. She's Tommy's." The lie came easily because it was simpler than the truth, that genetics were complicated and Sage could have been anyone's child. Peter nodded slowly. "What's her name?" "Sage." The word was both an offering and a warning. "That's beautiful." There was something wistful in his expression that made Rima's chest ache. "She's lucky to have you as her mother." The unexpected kindness was her undoing. Tears she'd been holding back for minutes, for hours, for years, threatened to spill over. "I really have to go," she whispered. This time, Peter didn't try to stop her, but as she reached for the door handle, his voice followed her. "I was wrong to put work before you. I won't make that mistake again." Rima froze with her hand on the door. When she turned back, Peter was pulling a business card from his jacket pocket. He approached slowly, like she was a frightened animal he didn't want to startle, and placed the card on the ground between them along with a $50 bill. "For the excellent service," he said quietly, "and I hope you'll call me when you're ready to talk." Then he was gone, leaving Rima alone in the alley with a business card and the knowledge that her carefully constructed life of invisibility had just shattered like glass on a restaurant floor. She stood there for several minutes, her hand still on the door handle, trying to process what had just happened. The $50 would cover groceries for a week, but accepting it felt like accepting charity from someone who had already seen too much of her failures. When she finally went back inside, Rosa was cleaning up spilled coffee grounds with quiet efficiency. The older woman had worked at Celestine's for 15 years and had a maternal instinct for troubled young women. "You okay, Mija?" Rosa asked, her voice gentle with concern. "I don't know," Rima admitted, tucking Peter's business card into her apron pocket. "I honestly don't know." Rosa studied her with knowing eyes. "Old boyfriend. Something like that. The kind that broke your heart or the kind that you broke his?" The perceptive question caught Rima off guard. "Both, I think." Rosa nodded wisely. "Those are the hardest kind to see again. They remind you of who you used to be." She paused in her cleaning to look directly at Rima. "But Mija, sometimes they also remind you of who you could still become." "What do you mean?" "You've been working here 2 years. You're a good girl, a hard worker, a loving mother. But you're also scared. I see it in how you jump when the door chimes too loud, how you always sit facing the exit, how you never talk about Sage's father." Rima felt exposed, not realizing her protective habits had been so obvious. "I don't know what happened to you before," Rosa continued, "but I know running from the past only works until the past finds you anyway. When it does, you get to choose. Keep running or stand still and see what happens." The advice was simple but profound. For 2 years, Rosa had been quietly watching over Rima, covering her tables when she needed to take phone calls from Sage's daycare, bringing extra food from home when money was tight, never asking questions but always offering support. "He left $50, Rima said, pulling out the bill. $50 for 1 cup of coffee?" Rosa whistled low. "Either he's showing off or he feels guilty about something. Maybe both. What are you going to do?" Rima looked at the business card in her hand, then at Rosa's kind, weathered face. "I don't know yet. But thank you for watching out for me all this time." Rosa smiled. "That's what family does, Mija. And family doesn't always share blood." Chapter 4. Breaking Point. The Crisis. 10 days after Peter's appearance at Celestine's kitchen, Rima woke to the sound of Sage coughing, a deep, concerning sound that sent immediate alarm bells through her maternal instincts. She pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of fever. "Mama," Sage whimpered, her usually bright eyes dull and unfocused. "My chest hurts." Rima's heart clenched. She'd been dreading this moment for 3 years, the inevitable childhood illness that would force her to choose between missing work and leaving Sage alone. But as she listened to her daughter's labored breathing, she realized this wasn't a choice at all. Sage had been fighting what seemed like a simple cold for several days, but overnight it had clearly developed into something more serious. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Rima lifted her shirt to check, she could see the slight pulling around her ribs that indicated respiratory distress. "We're going to see a doctor, baby," she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as she gathered clothes and essentials into a bag. The emergency room at General Medical Center was exactly as Rima remembered from Sage's birth: overcrowded, understaffed, and operating on a triage system that didn't favor people without insurance. She'd filled out the paperwork with shaking hands, knowing that every minute of treatment would add to a bill she couldn't afford, but watching Sage struggle to breathe made financial concerns secondary. After 3 hours in the waiting room, they were finally seen by a tired resident who diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed antibiotics that cost more than Rima made in 2 days. The pharmacy downstairs wouldn't accept her payment plan request, so she paid with the emergency credit card she'd sworn never to use, the one with the crushing interest rate that would turn a $100 prescription into a months-long financial nightmare. "She needs rest, plenty of fluids, and someone to monitor her breathing," the doctor said, already moving toward his next patient. "Bring her back if the fever doesn't break in 48 hours. Back in their studio apartment, Rima set up what she privately called crisis mode. Every pillow and blanket arranged to keep Sage comfortable, water and juice within reach, thermometer and medicine on the nightstand. She called Celestine's kitchen to explain she couldn't work her next 3 shifts, knowing that missed shifts meant missed rent money, but unable to leave Sage alone. For the next 72 hours, Rima barely slept. She sponged Sage down when the fever spiked, held her when coughing fits left her exhausted and scared, and counted every labored breath in the dark hours before dawn, when her daughter's temperature seemed to climb, no matter what she did. On the third night, Sage's fever broke 103 degrees. Rima bundled her daughter in a blanket and took a taxi to the emergency room, spending money she didn't have because she was too exhausted to think about bus routes and transfers. "We need to admit her for observation," the attending physician said after listening to Sage's lungs. "Her oxygen saturation is low, and she's showing signs of respiratory distress." "How much will that cost?" Rima asked, though she already knew the answer would be devastating. The intake coordinator quoted a figure that might as well have been $1 million. Rima stared at the papers in her hands, seeing her carefully built life crumble around the edges. Without insurance, even a single night in the hospital would bankrupt them. "We can set up a payment plan," the coordinator offered, but her tone suggested she'd had this conversation before and knew how it usually ended. Rima signed the papers because she had no choice. Sage's health was worth more than her credit score, worth more than the apartment they'd probably lose, worth more than any sacrifice she might have to make. That's how Zara Bell Washington found her sister, 6 hours later, passed out from exhaustion in a plastic chair beside Sage's hospital bed, having sustained herself on nothing but vending machine coffee and determination for the better part of a week. "Jesus, Rima," Zara Bell whispered, gently shaking her sister awake. "Why didn't you call me?" Rima's eyes fluttered open, disoriented and sluggish. "Zara, how did you—" "Miss Dolores called me when you didn't bring Sage yesterday. I've been looking for you." Zara Bell was a nurse at the children's hospital across town, and she took one look at her sister's pale face and hollow eyes before switching into professional mode. "When's the last time you ate something?" "I don't remember." Rima tried to sit up straight and immediately felt the world tilt dangerously. Sage is sick, pneumonia. They want to keep her for observation, but the bill doesn't matter right now. Zarabel pressed a protein bar from her purse into Rima's hands. Eat this. When's the last time you slept? I can't sleep. I have to watch her breathing. What if... Rima. Zarabel's voice was gentle but firm. You're going to make yourself sick, and then what good will you be to Sage? She needs you healthy. But even as her sister spoke sense, Rima couldn't make herself relax. Every few minutes, she found herself checking Sage's chest to make sure it was still rising and falling, counting breaths, watching the monitors that tracked her daughter's vital signs. I should have brought her in sooner, Rima whispered. I kept thinking it was just a cold, that I couldn't afford. Stop. Zarabel took her sister's hand. You did everything right. Pneumonia can develop quickly in little ones. This isn't your fault. But Rima couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart. The medical bills, the missed work, the constant exhaustion. She'd been holding it all together through sheer force of will, and now that will was cracking under the pressure. That's when Phoenix Castell appeared in the doorway, carrying flowers and wearing the kind of expensive suit that didn't belong in a public hospital. Excuse me, he said politely. Are you Rima Washington? Rima's tired mind struggled to place him. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with kind eyes and an air of professional competence. I'm Phoenix Castell from Metropolitan Community Health Fund, he continued, producing an official-looking ID badge. We're a nonprofit that partners with hospitals to provide emergency medical assistance for families experiencing financial hardship. Your sister contacted us about your situation. Zarabel looked confused. I didn't... Actually, Phoenix said smoothly, the hospital's social services department referred your case after seeing your insurance status. We'd like to cover your daughter's medical expenses and ensure she receives the best possible care. That's... Rima's exhausted mind couldn't process what he was offering. How much assistance? Complete coverage, Phoenix said simply. There would be some paperwork to authorize payment arrangements, but no out-of-pocket costs for you. Rima looked at Zarabel, who nodded encouragingly. Let them help, her sister whispered. Phoenix presented the authorization forms to both sisters. Since you're the mother, you'll need to sign here, he told Rima. And since you listed your sister as emergency contact, we need her signature as witness to ensure everything is properly documented. Despite her exhaustion, Rima read through the key points of the forms: authorization for a nonprofit to work with the hospital billing department, privacy waivers that would allow the fund to coordinate with healthcare providers, and financial agreements that placed no obligation on her family. Zarabel reviewed the documents as well, her nursing background helping her understand the medical language. This looks legitimate, she told Rima quietly. Together, both sisters signed the papers that would change everything, though neither realized that the Metropolitan Community Health Fund had been hastily created and funded by Peter Charles Avance just days earlier. Thank you, she whispered as Phoenix gathered the signed documents. Just focus on taking care of your little girl, he said gently. Everything else will be handled. After he left, Rima finally allowed herself to sleep, holding Sage's small hand and breathing in sync with the gentle rhythm of the monitors. For the first time in days, someone else was taking care of the crisis, and she could simply be a mother watching over her child. She didn't yet know that the Avance Foundation paperwork she'd signed would change everything, or that Peter Charles Avance was sitting in his office across town, receiving updates on Sage's condition every hour and quietly ensuring that the best pediatric specialists in the city would be consulting on her case. Sometimes help came from unexpected places, even when you were too tired to question why. Chapter 5. Reluctant Haven. The Healing Resistance. When Rima woke in the hospital chair the next morning, she found Peter Charles Avance asleep in the chair beside her, still wearing yesterday's suit, his usually immaculate hair disheveled and his hand resting protectively near Sage's bed. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her sleep-fogged mind struggling to process his presence. Then reality crashed back. The Foundation representative, the paperwork she'd signed, the too convenient appearance of help exactly when she needed it most. "You," she breathed, the word carrying 3 years of anger and exhaustion. Peter's eyes opened immediately, alert despite having slept in a chair. "How are you feeling?" "How am I?" Rima's voice caught between fury and disbelief. "How long have you been here?" "About 6 hours." Peter straightened in the chair, wincing slightly as his back protested the awkward sleeping position. "I wanted to make sure she was okay." Rima looked at her daughter, whose breathing had finally settled into a natural rhythm, the oxygen mask removed and her fever broken. Relief flooded through her before anger could take its place. "The Foundation," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "That was you. It wasn't a question, and Peter didn't try to deny it." "Yes. I signed those papers thinking I was accepting help from strangers." Rima's hands clenched into fists. "You deceived me. I helped you." Peter's voice was calm, but she could see tension in the line of his shoulders. Sage needed medical care, and you couldn't afford it. The details of how that happened seemed less important than making sure she got what she needed. "The details?" Rima stood up so quickly that the chair rolled backward. "The details matter, Peter. I don't want your help. I don't want your money. I don't want you here." "Mama?" Sage's small voice interrupted their argument. She was awake, looking between the two adults with the wide-eyed confusion of a child who sensed conflict but didn't understand it. Rima immediately switched into mother mode, her voice gentle as she moved to Sage's bedside. "Hey, baby, how are you feeling?" "Better," Sage said, though her voice was still hoarse from coughing. Her eyes drifted to Peter with curious interest. "Who's that man?" Rima felt Peter's presence like heat behind her, but she focused on her daughter. "He's someone Mama used to know." "I'm Peter," he said quietly, not moving closer but making his voice soft and non-threatening. "I'm glad you're feeling better." Sage studied him with the frank assessment that only 3-year-olds could manage. "You look sad." The observation was so unexpected and accurate that Rima felt something shift in her chest. She glanced back at Peter and saw that Sage was right. Beneath his composed exterior, there was a deep sadness that she'd missed in her own anger. "Sometimes grown-ups look sad," Sage continued with matter-of-fact wisdom. "Mama looks sad sometimes, too." The simple truth of it hung in the air between them. Rima realized that her daughter had been watching her more closely than she'd thought, seeing through the brave face she tried to maintain. "We should go," Rima said, reaching for the hospital bag she'd packed. "You're feeling better, and we don't need to stay here anymore." "Actually," Peter said carefully, "the doctor wants to keep her for one more day of observation, just to be safe." Rima turned to face him fully. "How do you know what the doctor wants?" "Because I've been talking to her medical team. The pediatric pulmonologist wants to make sure her lung function is completely stable before discharge." "You have no right." "I have every right to care about your welfare." Peter's composure cracked slightly, showing the emotion beneath. "Both of you." The possessive note in his voice sent warning bells through Rima's system. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of: Peter's money and influence taking control of her life, making decisions about her and Sage without her consent. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to swoop in and take over just because you have money and connections." "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing, Peter?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using my daughter's illness to insert yourself into our lives." Peter was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. I'm trying to take care of the people I love." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was ready to cross. Rima felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to maintain her defensive stance. "You don't love us," she said. "You don't even know us anymore. I know that you've been working double shifts to keep a roof over Sage's head. I know that you've been living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from disaster. I know that you haven't bought yourself new clothes in 2 years because every dollar goes to taking care of your daughter." Peter's voice was quiet but relentless. "I know that you've been carrying this burden alone for 3 years, and you're exhausted." Each observation hit like a physical blow because they were all true. Rima had thought she'd been hiding her struggles better than that. "How do you know all of that?" "Because I've been watching over you." Peter's honesty was brutal and gentle at the same time. Not stalking, not intruding, just making sure you were safe. "For how long?" "6 months." Rima sank back into the hospital chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "You've been watching me for 6 months and you're just now making contact?" "I was building a case." "A case for what?" Peter's expression hardened with something that looked like controlled fury. "Against Tommy Morrison and his family. For what they did to you." The mention of Tommy's name made Rima's blood run cold. "What case?" "Peter, what are you talking about?" "Later," he said, glancing meaningfully at Sage, who was listening to their conversation with rapt attention. "We need to focus on getting her healthy first." Rima wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but Sage was looking between them with growing anxiety, and the last thing she wanted was to upset her daughter while she was still recovering. "Fine," she said, "but after she's released, I want answers. I want to know exactly what you think you're doing, and then I want you to leave us alone." "Okay," Peter agreed, though something in his expression suggested he had no intention of disappearing from their lives again. Dr. Chen, the pediatric pulmonologist, arrived for evening rounds and confirmed that Sage could be discharged the following morning if her overnight breathing studies looked good. She was a kind woman who spoke directly to Sage rather than over her head, explaining in simple terms how her lungs were healing. "You're a very brave girl," Dr. Chen told Sage. "Your mama has taken excellent care of you." After the doctor left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the hospital room. Sage was getting tired again, the lingering effects of illness making her drowsy, but she was fighting sleep. "I don't want to go back to sleep," she whispered to Rima. "What if the coughing comes back?" Rima's heart broke a little. Sage had been frightened by her own illness, and now sleep felt dangerous to her. "I'll stay right here," Rima promised. "I won't leave your side." "Can the man stay too?" Sage asked unexpectedly. "He has kind hands." Rima looked at Peter, who had indeed been careful and gentle in his interactions with Sage, never reaching toward her without permission, never speaking too loudly or moving too quickly. "If your mama says it's okay," Peter said quietly. Rima wanted to say no, wanted to maintain the boundaries she'd tried to establish. But Sage was looking at her with hopeful eyes, and she was still weak and scared, and sometimes being a good mother meant putting aside personal feelings for a child's comfort. "Okay," she said reluctantly. "He can stay." As Sage finally drifted off to sleep, her small hand holding onto Peter's finger with surprising trust, Rima found herself studying the man she'd once loved. There were new lines around his eyes, a weight to his shoulders that hadn't been there in college, and something in his expression when he looked at Sage that made her chest tight with complicated emotions. Whatever Peter was planning, whatever case he was building against Tommy, it was clear that his feelings for her, and now for Sage, were real. The question was whether that made him more dangerous or less. Chapter 6. Evidence and Confessions. The investigation unfolds. The guest cottage on Peter's estate felt like stepping into another world. Rima had agreed to let him bring them there, only because Sage needed a quiet place to recover, and their studio apartment, with its thin walls and noisy neighbors, wasn't conducive to healing. She'd set strict conditions: separate bedrooms, temporary arrangement only, and she would pay rent with her freelance marketing income. Peter had accepted her terms without argument, though Rima suspected he was humoring her, rather than truly agreeing to treat this as a business arrangement. The cottage itself was beautiful without being ostentatious: exposed wooden beams, comfortable furniture, a kitchen stocked with more food than Rima had seen in one place since before Sage was born. French doors opened onto a garden where Sage could play safely, and the master bedroom had a reading nook perfect for a recovering 3-year-old who needed quiet entertainment. It had been 3 days since they'd left the hospital, and Sage was steadily improving. Her appetite was returning, her energy levels were slowly climbing, and the frightening cough that had sent them to the emergency room was finally fading. She'd taken to Peter with the easy acceptance of childhood, calling him Peter and showing him her books and drawings with increasing confidence. Rima was less adaptable. Every kindness from Peter felt like a debt she couldn't repay. Every comfort in the cottage reminded her of how precarious her normal life was. Every moment of security made her more anxious about the inevitable return to reality. She was working on her laptop in the cottage's living room, catching up on social media campaigns while Sage napped, when Peter knocked on the front door. He'd been giving them space since they'd arrived, checking in each morning and evening, but otherwise respecting the boundaries she'd established. "Come in," she called, not looking up from her screen. Peter entered carrying a manila envelope thick with documents. His expression was serious in a way that made Rima's stomach clench with foreboding. "We need to talk," he said. "Sage is sleeping." "This is about Tommy." Rima saved her work and closed the laptop, bracing herself for whatever revelation Peter had been withholding. "What about him?" Peter sat across from her, the envelope resting on the coffee table between them, like a piece of evidence in a trial. For a moment he seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I told you I'd been building a case," he said finally. "I think it's time you knew what I found." He opened the envelope and pulled out a single document: financial records from Morrison Construction. Even at first glance, Rima could see red marks and highlighted sections that indicated problems. "Tommy Morrison is not the man you married," Peter began, his voice measured and controlled. "Or rather, he is exactly the man you married, but you never knew who that really was." Rima stared at the financial analysis in front of her, trying to process what she was seeing. "What am I looking at?" "Systematic fraud," Peter said simply. "Tommy's been underbidding on city contracts by cutting corners on safety and materials. He pays workers below minimum wage and pockets the difference between what he charges the city and what he actually spends." The scope of the theft was staggering. While she'd been choosing between groceries and gas money, Tommy had been stealing from public projects and vulnerable workers. "How much money?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Conservative estimate: $2 million over the past 5 years. The figure was staggering. While she'd been clipping coupons and choosing between groceries and gas money, Tommy had been stealing millions from city projects and vulnerable workers. "That's not all," Peter continued, pulling out another set of documents. "OSHA has been receiving anonymous complaints about safety violations on Morrison construction sites for 2 years. Inadequate fall protection, defective equipment, workers forced to operate machinery without proper training." The photographs that accompanied the reports were damning. Construction sites with obvious safety hazards, equipment that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, workers in situations that made Rima's stomach turn. 3 men have been seriously injured on Tommy's sites in the past 18 months, Peter said quietly. "One of them, Miguel Santos, is permanently disabled. Tommy's insurance company denied his claim based on alleged worker negligence." Rima felt sick. But if Tommy was cutting corners on safety, then Miguel's injury was Tommy's fault, not his own. Peter's controlled fury was becoming more apparent with each revelation. Miguel has 3 children. His wife works 2 jobs trying to support the family while he deals with chronic pain and limited mobility. The injustice of it made Rima's hands shake. While she'd been struggling to survive Tommy's abandonment, other families had been suffering because of his greed and negligence. "There's more," Peter said, and his voice carried a note of warning that made Rima brace herself. The next document was a tax analysis of Marlo Morrison's Hands Helping Hearts charity organization. What Rima saw made her understanding of Tommy's family shift into sharper, uglier focus. "Your former mother-in-law has been running a fake charity for 6 years, Peter explained. They collect donations for disadvantaged children and community development. But 90% of the money goes to administrative costs, which means Marlo's salary, travel expenses, and personal purchases." The paper trail was extensive. Marlo had used charity funds to pay for luxury vacations, high-end clothing, jewelry, and even home renovations. She'd bought designer handbags with money donated by well-meaning church congregations who thought they were helping children in need. She's stolen approximately $400,000 from people who were trying to do good in their community, Peter said. And she's been claiming tax deductions for charitable work while living off the donations. Rima felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. They destroyed me for being poor while they were literally stealing from poor people. Yes, the simple confirmation hit harder than a longer explanation would have. Marlo Morrison had looked down on Rima for her working-class background while simultaneously stealing from the working class. She'd called Rima a gold digger while she was literally digging gold from charity donations. "How did you find all of this?" Rima asked. "Forensic accountants, private investigators, and public records research," Peter replied. "Most of this information was hiding in plain sight once we knew where to look. Tommy and his family got careless because they thought they were untouchable." Peter pulled out another document, bank records showing unusual cash deposits and transfers between Tommy's business account and his mother's charity. "They've been laundering money through the charity," he explained. "Tommy funnels excess profits from his fraudulent contracts to Marlo. She runs it through Hands Helping Hearts as fake donations, then transfers it back to him as consulting fees for construction projects that never happen." The complexity of the fraud was stunning. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a sophisticated operation that had been running for years. "But here's the thing that makes me angriest," Peter said, and for the first time his professional composure cracked slightly. "They had all of this money, millions of dollars from fraud and theft, and they threw you out in the rain with a newborn baby because you weren't good enough for them." The emotional weight of that truth hit Rima like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years believing that she'd been abandoned because she was inadequate somehow, not wealthy enough, not white enough, not worthy enough. But the reality was that Tommy's family had been criminals who'd destroyed her life not because she was lacking, but because they were monsters. "There's something else," Peter said gently, "something only you can help us prove." He showed her Derek's statement about the night they threw her out, how Tommy and Marlo had planned the whole thing, how the evidence had been planted, how they'd laughed about it afterward. "Derek's testimony is powerful, but prosecutors will want corroboration," Peter explained. "They'll want evidence that you were systematically abused and manipulated. Your testimony about their behavior patterns, their methods of control, their history of manipulation. That's crucial evidence that only you can provide." Rima stared at the documents spread across the coffee table. Years of fraud, theft, and deliberate cruelty laid out in official statements and witness accounts. For the first time, she understood that she wasn't just a victim in this story. "You need me to testify," she said. We need you to help us understand how they operate, Peter corrected. Your insights into their psychological manipulation tactics, your knowledge of their family dynamics, your ability to identify their patterns. That's not just helpful, it's essential. What would that mean? It means working with federal prosecutors to build the strongest possible case. It means helping other victims understand they're not alone. It means being part of the solution instead of just a casualty of their crimes. For the first time in 3 years, Rima felt something besides exhaustion and determination. She felt the cold, clean burn of righteous anger, and more importantly, she felt powerful. When do we start? She asked. Chapter 7. The First Strike. Justice Begins. The first blow against Tommy Morrison came at 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when OSHA investigators arrived unannounced at his largest construction site on Fifth Avenue. Rima watched the local news coverage from Peter's cottage, Sage playing with blocks at her feet, as reporters described safety inspections following multiple worker complaints filed over the past 6 months. Peter sat beside her on the couch, his laptop open to monitor social media responses and news coverage. This wasn't the coordinated media blitz Rima had expected. It was a single, carefully planned inspection that had drawn attention because of Tommy's confrontational response to the investigators. "How did you arrange this timing?" Rima asked, watching Tommy argue with an OSHA inspector on the morning news. 6 months of documentation, Peter replied, scrolling through real-time social media posts about the inspection. The investigation was triggered by legitimate safety complaints from workers. We just made sure those complaints were properly documented and reached the right people at the right time. On screen, Tommy appeared outside his construction site, his face red with rage, as he gestured angrily at the OSHA inspector, documenting violations. Even from a distance, Rima could see the familiar signs of his escalating temper. The clenched fists, the aggressive posture, the way he invaded other people's personal space when frustrated. The inspector, a middle-aged woman with 30 years of experience, remained calm while photographing equipment violations and interviewing workers. "Mr. Morrison," a reporter called out, "how do you respond to allegations of safety violations on your sites?" "This is harassment," Tommy shouted, pointing at the camera with the same aggressive finger-pointing Rima remembered from their worst fights. "Someone's targeting my business and I'm going to find out who. These are trumped-up charges from disgruntled employees who want to blame their own incompetence on my company." Rima felt a chill of old fear watching him lose control on television. This was the Tommy she remembered from their marriage. Irrational, paranoid, and looking for someone to blame for his own failures. But something in his eyes suggested that beneath the public outburst, his mind was already working on a different level, calculating his next moves even as he performed his injured victim routine for the cameras. "He knows someone's coming for him," she said quietly. "Let him know," Peter replied, though his voice carried less satisfaction than Rima had expected. Fear makes people make mistakes. But Tommy's paranoia proved more problematic than Peter had anticipated. Rather than the immediate social media outburst they'd expected, Tommy went silent for 3 days, consulting with lawyers, hiring reputation specialists, and carefully crafting his response strategy. When he finally emerged publicly, it was with a calculated counterattack that caught everyone off guard. "We have a problem," Phoenix announced during an emergency meeting in Peter's home office on Friday evening. He'd driven out from the city with urgent updates that couldn't wait for their regular Monday briefing. Rima had joined the meeting despite Peter's initial reluctance to involve her directly in the planning. She'd made it clear that she wouldn't be sidelined in her own story. If they were going after Tommy, she wanted to understand every risk and development. "Tommy's not reacting emotionally like we expected," Phoenix continued, spreading newspaper clippings and printed social media posts across Peter's desk. "He's getting expert help, and it's effective." The evidence was damning. Tommy had hired Kellerman and Associates, one of the city's most expensive reputation management firms, known for rehabilitating politicians and business executives caught in scandals. Within 72 hours, they'd crafted a narrative that painted Tommy as a hard-working small business owner being targeted by unnamed powerful interests. "Look at this," Phoenix said, showing them a professional video Tommy had posted on his company's social media accounts. In it, he appeared calm, reasonable, and dressed in work clothes instead of his usual expensive suits. The message was carefully crafted. He was a blue-collar entrepreneur being attacked by wealthy elites who wanted to destroy honest American businesses. "What can he actually do?" Rima asked, studying the polished messaging. "The documentation is real. The violations are documented." "He can muddy the waters," Phoenix explained, pulling up news articles on his tablet. "Make himself look like a victim, claim he's being framed, turn public opinion in his direction, and if he figures out who's behind the investigation—" "He can't touch us legally," Peter said firmly, though Rima noticed tension in his voice. "Everything we've done has been through proper channels." "But he might try to retaliate in other ways," Phoenix continued, "especially if he discovers Rima's involvement. And there's something else. He's filed preliminary paperwork for a defamation lawsuit against unnamed parties for what he claims is a coordinated harassment campaign." The room fell silent. A defamation lawsuit, even a frivolous one, could tie up the investigation in legal proceedings for months, while Tommy had time to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. "How strong is his legal position?" Peter asked. "Weak on the merits, but potentially effective as a delay tactic," Phoenix replied. "His attorneys are claiming prosecutorial misconduct and demanding to know who's behind the investigation. If they can prove we coordinated with law enforcement in any way that violates due process, or if they can frame this as wealthy interests manipulating the justice system." "We followed all proper channels," Peter said, but his voice carried less certainty than usual. "We did, but we also moved efficiently, and Tommy's lawyers are smart enough to exploit anything that looks suspicious. They're already questioning why OSHA suddenly became interested in Morrison construction after years of routine inspections." The second phase of their plan launched the following week, when the city's financial crimes unit received detailed documentation about irregularities in Morrison Construction's bidding history. The analysis, prepared by Peter's forensic accountants, highlighted patterns that suggested systematic fraud over several years. But Tommy's response was swift and more sophisticated than they'd anticipated. By Thursday morning, Tommy had not only hired a criminal defense attorney, but had also filed an injunction to halt any further investigation, pending resolution of his defamation claims. It was a brilliant legal strategy: use the civil courts to stop the criminal investigation while building a public narrative of persecution. "This is bad," Phoenix announced during another emergency meeting. "Tommy's lawyers filed an injunction claiming the investigation violates his due process rights. They're arguing that unnamed powerful interests are manipulating law enforcement to target him unfairly." Peter stared at the legal documents Phoenix had placed on his desk. For the first time since this began, Rima saw doubt in his eyes. "How long could this delay things?" Peter asked. "Months, potentially. Maybe longer if they can make their harassment claims stick." Rima felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settling over her. "So he wins?" "Not wins," Phoenix said carefully, "but he buys time. Time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and build his victim narrative. And there's something else that's more concerning." Phoenix pulled out another document, a settlement offer letter. "Miguel Santos is having second thoughts about his lawsuit. Tommy's people approached his family yesterday, not with threats, but with a settlement offer. Enough money to pay for his medical bills, ongoing care, and compensation for lost wages. They're being very smart about this. No intimidation, just a generous offer to make the problem go away quietly. The room fell silent again. Losing Miguel's testimony would severely weaken their case, and Peter realized his strategic thinking had underestimated Tommy's ability to fight back effectively. "What did Miguel say?" Rima asked. "He hasn't decided yet, but his wife is pushing him to take the money. She's tired of the stress, tired of fighting, and they genuinely need the financial security. From her perspective, taking a settlement that guarantees their family's future makes more sense than gambling on a lengthy legal battle that might not succeed." Peter was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled frustration. This was the one scenario he hadn't adequately planned for, Tommy being smart enough to use both the legal system and financial pressure defensively instead of just lashing out emotionally. "There's more," Phoenix continued reluctantly. "Two other injured workers who were ready to testify have also received settlement offers. Tommy's crisis management team is systematically identifying everyone who might speak against him and making it financially attractive for them to stay quiet." "That's obstruction of justice," Rima said. "It's smart legal strategy," Phoenix corrected. "Civil settlements with non-disclosure agreements aren't illegal, even if the timing is suspicious. Tommy's lawyers are being very careful to stay within legal boundaries while effectively neutralizing witnesses." The weight of Tommy's counterattack was becoming clear. He wasn't just fighting the investigation, he was dismantling it piece by piece, using professional legal and public relations strategies. "We need to regroup," Peter said finally, and for the first time since this began, his voice carried uncertainty. "Find another approach." "What if we can't?" Rima asked. "What if he's just better at this game than we thought?" Peter looked at her, and she could see the frustration and doubt he was trying to hide. The man who had built a business empire by controlling every variable was facing an opponent who was proving equally strategic and far more desperate. "Then we adapt," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "But we don't give up." As Phoenix gathered his documents and prepared to leave, Rima realized that justice wasn't guaranteed just because they had evidence and good intentions. Tommy was fighting for his life and freedom, and that desperation was making him more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. For the first time since this began, she wondered if they were actually going to win. Chapter 8: Trust and Vulnerability. Love rebuilding. The fallout from Tommy's investigation was immediate and intense. Within 48 hours of the OSHA inspection, Rima's old phone number was somehow leaked online, flooding her voicemail with messages ranging from supportive to threatening. Peter arranged for a new phone with an unlisted number and increased security around the property, but the violation of privacy left Rima feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I can't take Sage to the grocery store without wondering if someone's going to recognize me," Rima said, pacing the cottage's living room while Sage napped. "This isn't what I wanted when we started this." Peter looked up from his laptop, where he'd been monitoring online discussions about Tommy's case. "The threatening calls are being traced by law enforcement. Most of them are just people venting online anger, not real threats." "Most of them," Rima repeated, focusing on the qualifier. "What about the ones that aren't just online anger?" Peter's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "Phoenix is working with the sheriff's department to monitor anyone with a concerning background. You're safe here." "That's not really an answer." "Two of the callers have criminal records for assault," Peter admitted reluctantly. "But they're both in different states, and local law enforcement is aware of the situation." Rima sank into the armchair across from him, suddenly exhausted. "I've made everything worse, haven't I? Tommy's getting more sympathy now. People think I'm the vindictive ex-wife." "Some people think that," Peter said honestly. "But the people who matter, prosecutors, investigators, journalists who understand the documentation, they know you're telling the truth." "Some people think that," Peter said carefully. but the people who matter, prosecutors, investigators, journalists who understand the evidence, they know you're telling the truth. And in the meantime, my 3-year-old daughter is stuck in hiding because her mother decided to pick a fight with a criminal. Peter closed his laptop and moved to sit on the coffee table in front of her chair, close enough that their knees almost touched. Sage isn't stuck in hiding. She's safe and loved, and recovering from pneumonia in a beautiful place where she can play in the garden and read books and not worry about anything. But for how long? What happens when this is over? Do we go back to our studio apartment and pretend none of this happened? Do we change our names and move to another state? Do we... Rima. Peter's voice was gentle but firm. Stop. Stop what? Stop trying to control every possible future outcome. Stop catastrophizing. Stop pushing me away because you're scared. The accuracy of his observation hit like a slap. I'm not pushing you away. Yes, you are. You've been doing it since the day I walked into Celestine's kitchen. Every time we get closer, you find a reason to create distance. Rima wanted to deny it, but the truth was uncomfortable and obvious. She had been pushing him away, setting up barriers, insisting on paying rent, maintaining separate bedrooms, treating their arrangement like a business transaction instead of what it actually was. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. Do what? Trust someone again. Let someone take care of me. Accept help without feeling like I owe something in return. Rima's voice cracked slightly. Tommy convinced me that I was a burden, that I was lucky anyone would want me, that everything good in my life was charity I didn't deserve. Peter's expression darkened with anger, but his voice remained gentle. Tommy was a fool and a liar. Maybe, but those voices are still in my head. When you pay for Sage's medical bills, I hear that I'm a financial burden. When you give us this beautiful place to stay, I hear that I can't provide for my own daughter. When you look at me the way you used to look at me, I hear that it's too good to be true, and you'll leave when you realize what I really am. And what do you think you really are? Rima's throat tightened with unshed tears. Damaged, used up, not worth fighting for. Peter was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Do you want to know what I see when I look at you? He asked finally. I'm not sure. I see a woman who was thrown away by people who were too stupid to recognize her worth. I see someone who took the worst thing that ever happened to her and used it to become stronger instead of bitter. I see a mother who works 18-hour days to give her daughter a good life, who fights federal investigations to protect other families, who faces down public humiliation rather than let criminals go unpunished. Rima felt tears threatening to spill over. Peter, I see the woman I fell in love with in college, but better, wiser, fiercer, more beautiful because of everything she's survived. Peter reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. And I see someone who's afraid to let herself be happy because happiness feels dangerous after so much pain. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable. Peter moved from the coffee table to sit beside her on the chair, pulling her against his chest while she cried for everything she'd lost, everything she'd endured, and everything she was afraid to hope for. I don't know how to trust this, she whispered against his shoulder. You don't have to trust it all at once, Peter said, his hand stroking her hair. Start small. Trust that I'm going to be here tomorrow. Trust that I won't hurt Sage. Trust that when I say I love you, I mean it without conditions or expectations. What if Tommy wins? What if the investigation falls apart and he comes after us? Then we deal with it together. But Rima, he's not going to win. The evidence is too strong and too many people are watching now. He's done. They sat together in comfortable silence while Rima processed the emotional weight of the conversation. For 3 years, she'd been carrying the burden of survival alone, making every decision based on worst-case scenarios and protective instincts. The idea of sharing that burden with someone else felt foreign and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Mama?" Sage's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom. "I'm thirsty." Rima started to get up, but Peter's hand on her arm stopped her. "I'll get it. You rest." "She likes the cups with the straws," Rima said automatically. "And if she's still warm, she might want ice." "Cups with straws, possible ice. Got it." Peter kissed her forehead before standing. "Anything else?" "She might want to hear about the time you found the baby owl in college. She likes animal stories." Peter's smile was soft and genuine. "I can do that." Watching him walk towards Sage's room with such natural ease, Rima felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't Peter trying to buy her affection or prove his worth through grand gestures. This was simply a man who cared about her daughter's comfort and wanted to help in whatever small way he could. When he returned 20 minutes later, Sage was settled back in her bed with water and a story, and Peter's expression was slightly awed. "She's incredible," he said, settling back beside Rima on the chair. "Smart and funny and so much like you, it's startling." "She asked about you the other day," Rima admitted, "whether you were going to be her new daddy." Peter's intake of breath was sharp. "What did you tell her?" "That grown-up relationships are complicated and she shouldn't worry about it." Rima looked at him carefully. "What would you have wanted me to tell her?" "The truth. That I love her mother very much, and I hope someday she'll let me be part of your family, officially." The word officially hung between them like a question and a promise. Rima felt her carefully constructed walls cracking, not from pressure or manipulation, but from the steady warmth of someone who had never stopped believing she was worth loving. "Peter," she said quietly. "Yes?" "Tomorrow, when Sage wakes up, maybe we could make breakfast together, all three of us, like a family." His smile was brighter than sunrise. "I'd like that very much." For the first time in 3 years, Rima allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder or preparing for the next crisis. It felt dangerous and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. It felt like hope. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Legal Victory. 6 months after the first OSHA inspection, the criminal investigation reached a critical turning point. The legal delays Tommy had orchestrated had actually worked against him. While his lawyers stalled, more witnesses came forward, more evidence surfaced, and federal prosecutors had time to build an airtight case. The injunction Tommy's lawyers had filed was ultimately overturned when prosecutors presented additional evidence that proved their investigation was legitimate and properly conducted. Rima woke to find Peter already dressed and drinking coffee at 5:30 a.m., his phone buzzing with updates from Phoenix and the legal team. "Today's the day," he said, looking up from a text message with grim satisfaction. "Federal prosecutors are filing charges against Morrison Construction. The grand jury voted to indict yesterday." Rima felt her stomach clench with nervous energy. After months of delays and setbacks, she'd almost stopped believing this day would come. "What changed?" she asked, settling beside him at the kitchen table. "Miguel Santos changed his mind about the settlement," Peter replied. "When he saw how many other workers were coming forward, he decided he couldn't take money to stay quiet while other families suffered." The breakthrough had come when Rima agreed to speak directly with Miguel and his wife, sharing her own story of being silenced and isolated. Her testimony about Tommy's manipulation tactics had helped other victims understand that they weren't alone and that speaking up was the only way to prevent future harm. "The federal prosecutors have been building this case for 8 months, Peter continued. Tommy's delay tactics gave them time to find even more evidence. Bank records, tax documents, witness testimonies from 15 different workers. It's comprehensive. At 9:15 a.m., Rima's phone rang. It was Phoenix calling from downtown where he'd been monitoring the federal courthouse as part of their legal team's coordination efforts. "It's starting," Phoenix said, his voice tight with excitement. "Federal marshals just entered Morrison Construction's offices with arrest warrants. I can see them through the office windows from the coffee shop across the street." Rima felt her hands start to shake. After 3 years of Tommy living freely while she struggled to survive his abandonment, the moment of justice felt surreal. "Are you watching it happen right now?" she asked. "Yes. They're bringing him out in handcuffs now. He looks completely shocked." Peter took the phone. "What's his demeanor?" "Stunned. He's trying to argue with the agents, but they're not engaging. His legal team must not have warned him this was coming today." An hour later, the local news interrupted regular programming with footage of the arrest. Rima and Peter watched as Tommy Morrison, owner of Morrison Construction, was led from his office building in handcuffs. The news cameras had arrived after Phoenix's call, capturing the aftermath rather than the arrest itself. Unlike the polished, controlled image he'd been projecting through his crisis management team, this Tommy looked disheveled and desperate. The reporter's voice carried over the footage. "Morrison is facing federal charges including conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of federal labor laws, tax evasion, and wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 25 years in federal prison." Rima watched her ex-husband's face on television and felt something she hadn't expected. A strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because justice was finally happening, but sadness because she could see the broken man beneath the criminal. This was the person she'd once loved, now destroyed by his own greed and cruelty. "How do you feel?" Peter asked, settling beside her on the couch. "Empty," Rima said honestly. "I thought I'd feel victorious or relieved, but mostly I just feel empty. That's normal. Closure doesn't always feel the way we expect it to." At 2:30 p.m., they received word that Marlo Morrison had been arrested at her home. Federal agents had found extensive records of her charity fraud in a home office that she'd apparently been using to coordinate the money laundering scheme with Tommy. Unlike her son, Marlo didn't resist arrest, but her booking photo showed a woman who looked decades older than her actual age. Keanu Morrison, Tommy's brother and business partner, was arrested that evening at his apartment. Phoenix reported that Keanu had been the most genuinely shocked by his arrest, suggesting he'd been a follower rather than a leader in the criminal enterprise. But the arrest that mattered most to Rima happened the next morning. At 10 a.m., Phoenix called with news that Derek Campbell, Tommy's former co-worker who had provided crucial testimony about the planted evidence, was being arrested for perjury after investigators discovered he'd initially lied about certain details to minimize his own involvement in the company's illegal activities. "Wait," Rima said, feeling panic rise in her chest. "Does this hurt our case?" "Actually, it helps," Phoenix explained. "Derek's arrest proved that the investigation is thorough and unbiased. When he was caught in inconsistencies, he told prosecutors the whole truth, including details that made Tommy look even worse. The truth that emerged was darker than anyone had expected. Derek revealed that Tommy hadn't just known about Marlowe's scheme to frame Rima, he had actively participated in planning it. Text messages recovered from Derek's phone showed Tommy discussing how to get rid of the wife and kid problem weeks before Sage was born. "The confirmation is finally coming out," Phoenix reported during an evening briefing. Derek admitted that Tommy told him he wanted out of the marriage, but was too much of a coward to ask for a divorce. Tommy was afraid Rima would get half his assets in a divorce settlement, so he decided to frame her for adultery instead. The admission hit Rima harder than she'd expected. For 3 years, she'd carried the possibility that Tommy had been manipulated, that he genuinely believed his mother's lies. Learning definitively that he'd been a willing participant in her destruction was both validating and heartbreaking. "I'm sorry," Peter said quietly. "I know that's not what you wanted to hear." "Actually, it is," Rima replied, surprising herself. "It means I wasn't wrong about who he really was. My instincts were right. I just ignored them because I wanted to believe in the fairy tale." 3 days after the arrests, Rima found herself in the federal courthouse for Tommy's arraignment. She hadn't planned to attend, but Phoenix had explained that, as a victim of Tommy's documented crimes, she had the right to observe the proceedings. The victim's rights coordinator had helped her complete the necessary paperwork to access the courtroom. Peter offered to come with her, but she wanted to face this moment alone. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. When Tommy was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, Rima was shocked by how much he'd changed in just 3 days. The confident, aggressive man from the news footage was gone, replaced by someone who looked diminished and frightened. Tommy's eyes scanned the courtroom and landed on Rima sitting in the back row. For a moment, their gazes met across the room that represented the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. She expected to feel anger or fear, but instead she felt nothing but pity for the man who had destroyed so many lives in pursuit of easy money. The arraignment itself was brief and procedural. Tommy pleaded not guilty to all charges, but his voice was barely audible when he spoke. His public defender, the reputation management team, and expensive lawyers had apparently abandoned him once the federal charges were filed, looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. Federal prosecutor Rebecca Martinez outlined the charges in clinical detail. The defendant systematically defrauded the city of approximately $2 million over 5 years through bid rigging and fraudulent billing. He endangered the lives of workers through deliberate safety violations that resulted in multiple serious injuries. He laundered money through a fake charity that stole donations intended for disadvantaged children. When Prosecutor Martinez mentioned the fake charity, Rima saw Tommy's shoulders slump even further. The weight of his crimes, laid out in stark legal language, seemed to be crushing him in real time. Given the defendant's flight risk and the severity of the charges, Prosecutor Martinez continued, the government requests that bail be denied. Tommy's lawyer made a brief argument for house arrest, but the judge wasn't convinced. The defendant has shown a pattern of manipulating witnesses and obstructing justice. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial. As Tommy was led away in shackles, he looked back at Rima one more time. This time, instead of the calculation or anger she'd seen in his eyes during their marriage, she saw something that looked like regret. Not regret for his crimes, she realized, but regret for being caught. Walking out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunlight, Rima felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For 3 years, Tommy had lived freely while she struggled to survive his abandonment. Now he would spend the next phase of his life in a federal prison cell, and she would spend hers building something beautiful with Peter and Sage. Over the following month, plea negotiations took place behind closed doors. Tommy's new court-appointed attorney, recognizing the strength of the evidence against his client, advised him to accept whatever deal the prosecutors offered, rather than risk a trial that he couldn't possibly win. The final plea hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in December, 6 weeks after Tommy's initial arrest. This time, Peter accompanied Rima to the courthouse, understanding that she needed his support for this final confrontation with her past. Tommy looked even smaller and more worn down than he had during the arraignment. When he stood to address the court, his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "I accept responsibility for my actions," he said, though the words sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. "I'm sorry for the harm I've caused." The judge accepted Tommy's plea deal. 8 years in federal prison plus restitution to all affected workers and families. Marlowe received 3 years for her charity fraud. Keanu, who had cooperated fully with investigators and demonstrated genuine remorse, received probation and community service. As the judge announced the sentences, Rima felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: complete closure. The legal proceedings had finally given her the definitive end she needed to the Tommy Morrison chapter of her life. Walking out of the courthouse for the last time, hand in hand with Peter, Rima realized that justice hadn't just been about punishment. It had been about validation. The legal system had confirmed what she'd always known. She wasn't the problem. Tommy was. She wasn't worthless. He was criminal. She hadn't deserved abandonment. He had deserved consequences. "How do you feel now?" Peter asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. "Free," Rima said, and for the first time in 3 years, the word felt completely true. "I feel free." Chapter 10. New Beginnings. The Wedding and Future. 3 months after Tommy's arrest, Peter proposed in the cottage garden, where Sage was picking flowers for a bouquet she was making, because flowers make people happy. He got down on one knee while Sage giggled and clapped her hands, presenting a ring that was elegant without being ostentatious, a classic solitaire diamond with 2 smaller stones on either side. "The center stone represents us," Peter explained, his voice slightly nervous despite his confidence. "The side stones represent our past and our future, everything that brought us together and everything we're going to build." "What about me?" Sage asked, not understanding the significance but wanting to be included. Peter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small jewelry box containing a delicate gold bracelet with a tiny heart charm. "This is for you, Sage. It means you're part of our family forever." Sage's squeal of delight was so loud that birds flew out of the nearby trees. She threw her arms around Peter's neck and declared him the best Peter in the whole world, which made both adults laugh through their tears. "Is that a yes?" Peter asked Rima, still kneeling in the garden dirt. "That's the biggest yes in the history of yes," Rima replied, laughing as he slipped the ring onto her finger. They planned their wedding for 4 months later, enough time to handle the legal paperwork properly, plan a meaningful ceremony, and allow Rima to testify at Tommy's sentencing first. She wanted that chapter of her life completely closed before beginning the new one. Tommy ultimately accepted a plea deal rather than face trial, 8 years in federal prison plus restitution to all affected workers and families. His criminal conviction, combined with his documented abandonment of Sage and the fraudulent document he'd forced Rima to sign, resulted in the complete termination of any parental rights he might have claimed. Marlowe received 3 years for her charity fraud. The legal proceedings finally gave Rima the closure she needed. No one from the Morrison family could ever threaten her or Sage again. Phoenix handled the wedding logistics with his usual efficiency, working with a local coordinator to transform the cottage garden into a ceremony space that looked like something from a fairy tale. Zara Bell flew in from Chicago to serve as maid of honor, bringing with her a wedding dress she'd secretly bought months earlier, just in case this day ever came. It was perfect, elegant but not overly formal, with lace sleeves that covered the small scars on Rima's arms from her hardest years and a flowing skirt that would photograph beautifully with Sage. The morning of the wedding, Rima woke feeling surprisingly calm. She'd expected nerves or panic or the familiar anxiety that had become her constant companion, but instead she felt peaceful and certain in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. "How are you feeling, baby?" Zara Bell asked, helping her with the final touches of makeup. "Like I'm finally doing something right," Rima replied honestly. "For the first time in years, I'm making a choice based on love instead of fear." Sage was beside herself with excitement, wearing a flower girl dress that made her look like a princess and practicing walking slowly, like a lady, while carrying her basket of rose petals. She'd been talking about the wedding for days, telling everyone who would listen that she was going to have a daddy and a mama and a big house with a garden. The guest list was small but meaningful. Zara Bell, Phoenix, Doctor. Chen, who had become a friend during Sage's recovery, Miguel Santos and his family, who had become symbols of the justice they'd fought for, and a few of Peter's closest business associates who had supported him through the investigation. Phoenix officiated the ceremony after getting ordained online specifically for the occasion. He'd written a service that acknowledged the unconventional path that had brought them together while focusing on the future they were choosing to build. Marriage, Phoenix began, is not about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own, whose strength supports your weaknesses, and whose love makes you want to become the best version of yourself. When it came time for vows, Peter spoke first, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion in his eyes. Rima, 5 years ago, I thought love meant grand gestures and perfect timing. I thought if I could just achieve enough, earn enough, build enough, I could create a life worthy of you. I was wrong. Love isn't about what you can provide. It's about showing up every day, especially when things are difficult. He looked at Sage, who was trying to stand still but bouncing slightly with excitement. You taught me that family isn't just about blood or legal documents. It's about choosing each other, protecting each other, and creating something beautiful together. I promise to be the father Sage deserves, the partner you need, and the man who never again puts anything above the people he loves. Rima's vows were shorter but no less meaningful. Peter, you found me when I was broken and you never tried to fix me. You just loved me while I fixed myself. You showed Sage what a good man looks like, and you showed me that it's possible to trust again without losing myself in the process. She took a shaky breath, looking at the small gathering of people who had become their chosen family. I promise to build something beautiful with you, not just a marriage, but a partnership that honors our past while embracing our future. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to trust you with our daughter's happiness, and to never again let fear make decisions for us. When Phoenix pronounced them husband and wife, Sage threw rose petals in the air and shouted, "Hooray!" with such enthusiasm that everyone burst into laughter. Peter's kiss was gentle and reverent, tasting of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. The reception was held in Peter's main house, where the dining room had been transformed with flowers from the garden and pictures chronicling their journey, college photos, pictures of Sage as a baby, recent images of the three of them building snowmen and reading books and becoming a family. During dinner, Miguel Santos stood to offer a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. To Rima and Peter, he said, raising his glass, who proved that justice and love are not abstract concepts. They are choices we make every day. Thank you for fighting for people like me and my family. Thank you for showing us that good people still exist in this world. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Rima found herself standing in the garden where everything had changed, watching Peter push Sage on the swing set while she giggled with pure joy. "Mrs. Avance," Phoenix said, appearing beside her with a glass of champagne. The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Avance. Rima Avance. It sounded like a new beginning, like the woman she was becoming rather than the woman she'd been. "How does it feel?" Phoenix asked. "Surreal," Rima admitted. 6 months ago, I was working double shifts just to keep us afloat. Now I'm married to a billionaire and living in a mansion. But that's not really what changed, is it? Rima looked at him curiously. What do you mean? 6 months ago, you were surviving. Now you're living. The mansion and the money are nice, but what really changed is that you're not afraid anymore. He was right. The external circumstances were dramatic, but the internal transformation was what truly mattered. She was no longer the woman who jumped at unexpected sounds or checked locks obsessively or planned escape routes from every room she entered. Peter wants to expand his foundation, Rima said. Create a comprehensive program for single mothers rebuilding their lives after domestic situations. He asked me to develop and run it. Are you going to do it? Yes, Rima said, surprised by how certain she sounded. I want to help other women who are where I was. I want them to know that survival is just the beginning. There's so much more possible if you're brave enough to reach for it. The program would include emergency housing assistance, job training, childcare support, and legal aid. Everything Rima wished she'd had access to during her darkest days. They already had commitments from local hospitals, legal clinics, and educational institutions to provide services. As the last guests departed, and the three of them settled into their new life together, Rima reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Tommy Morrison was serving an 8-year federal sentence. Marlowe's charity had been dissolved, and its assets distributed to legitimate organizations helping families in need. The construction industry had implemented stronger safety protocols to protect workers. Most importantly, families like Miguel's were getting the support they needed to rebuild their lives, and other women in situations like Rima's had resources to help them start over safely. That night, after Sage was asleep in her new room, decorated with princesses and unicorns and everything a little girl could want, Peter and Rima sat on their bedroom balcony, looking out over the garden where they'd been married. "Any regrets?" Peter asked, taking her hand and running his thumb over her wedding ring. "Only one," Rima said, snuggling closer to him in the cool evening air. "What's that?" "I regret that it took us so long to get here." She looked up at him with eyes that held no shadows, only love and possibility. "But maybe we needed the journey to appreciate the destination." Peter kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of all their tomorrows. "Diamond hearts never break," he whispered. "They just get stronger." And in the distance they could hear the gentle sound of their daughter's peaceful breathing, safe and loved, and surrounded by the kind of family that chooses each other every single day.